They crossed the ocean in chains, shipped to America as prisoners of war. Behind barbed wire, they braced for hunger, punishment, even hatred. But what they found was the opposite: full plates, fair treatment, and a glimpse of a life they had never known. For some, that glimpse was enough to change everything. When freedom came, they faced a decision no one expected: go back to a shattered Germany, or stay in the land of their former enemy. And many chose America. Reinhold Pabel, the escaped POW, who became a Chicago bookseller. Reinhold Pabel's life took one of the most unlikely turns of any German soldier in the Second World War. Born in 1915, he was drafted into the Wehrmacht and sent to fight in North Africa, where he was eventually captured by Allied forces as the campaign collapsed. Along with thousands of others, he was shipped across the Atlantic to the United States and placed in a prisoner of war camp in Illinois, not far from Chicago. Like many Germans, he had expected brutality and hunger, but what he found instead was order, food, and even opportunities to work. For many POWs, this was enough to wait out the end of the war. For Pabel, it was not. The barbed wire and watchtowers felt unbearable. He was restless, and he dreamed of freedom, not of returning to a Germany in ruins, but of starting fresh in America. In 1945, with the war nearing its end, Pabel made a daring choice. He escaped. While most escapees were quickly recaptured, Pabel had prepared carefully. He spoke English well enough to pass, and he understood the rhythms of American life. In Chicago, he disappeared into the crowd, taking the false name Ray Peters. With that identity, he built a new life, first finding work in publishing, later opening a bookstore. Chicago, a city full of immigrants and accents, was the perfect cover. No one questioned his background, and no one suspected that he had once been a German soldier. As Ray Peters, he married an American woman named Ruth, started a family, and became known as a friendly, cultured bookseller. For more than a decade, he lived undetected, building a reputation not as an enemy, but as a trusted neighbor. It was a complete reinvention. A man once behind American barbed wire, now part of the very society he had fought against. Eventually, however, his past caught up with him. In the mid-1950s, authorities uncovered that Ray Peters was really Reinhold Pabel, a German POW who had broken out of captivity. Normally, such a discovery would have meant deportation, but Pabel's case was different. By then, he was respected in his community. His bookstore was beloved, and his family deeply rooted in American life. Neighbors and newspapers defended him, portraying him not as a criminal, but as a man who had remade himself. Even officials saw little sense in tearing him away from the country he had clearly made his home. Instead of deportation, Pabel was granted forgiveness. He was allowed to remain, and in time became a naturalized American citizen. His life as a fugitive was over, but his story endured as an example of how even enemies could become part of America's fabric. From soldier to prisoner, from fugitive to citizen, Reinhold Pabel's journey was extraordinary. He lived out his days not as a figure of suspicion, but as a Chicago bookseller, remembered for his shelves of books rather than his years in uniform. His story stands as proof that sometimes the most remarkable transformations happen not on the battlefield, but in the quiet decision to begin again. Frederick Gartner, from German soldier to American memoir writer. If Reinhold Pabel's story was about daring escape and reinvention, Frederick Gartner's path could not have been more different. Where Pabel slipped through the fences and built a secret life as a fugitive in Chicago, Gartner stayed within the system, endured his captivity, and later chose to tell the world what it had meant to him. Gartner was barely 20 when he was drafted into the Wehrmacht, one of millions swept into the war. Captured by American forces, he was transported across the Atlantic and confined in a POW camp. Like so many Germans raised under Nazi propaganda, he expected cruelty and starvation. Instead, he found order, discipline, and fairness. The camps offered decent food, medical care, and structure. In many cases, prisoners were sent to work on American farms, and Gartner joined them. In the quiet of the fields, far from the thunder of battle, he saw a side of America that shocked him: prosperous, confident, and strangely humane. When the war ended, and he was shipped back to Germany, the contrast could not have been starker. His homeland was devastated, cities reduced to rubble, shortages everywhere. Compared to the abundance he had witnessed in captivity, post-war Germany seemed broken and hopeless. Those memories stayed with him, and eventually he found a way to return to the United States, this time not as a prisoner, but as an immigrant, unlike most former POWs who blended into their new lives quietly. Gartner chose to speak. He wrote a memoir, Prisoner of Peace, recounting his capture, his time in America, and how it changed him. He admitted that the fairness of his captors had reshaped his view of the country, planting respect where suspicion had once been. His words offered Americans a unique perspective, that by treating their prisoners with dignity, they had achieved something no battlefield victory could. They had won over the minds of their enemies. For Gartner, captivity was not an ending but a beginning. Where others remembered the fences, he remembered the humanity. And in telling that story, he bridged the gap between the world he had been born into and the one he chose to call home. Conrad Vogt-Svendsen, captured in North Africa, reborn in America. If Pabel's story was one of escape and Gartner's of reflection, Conrad Vogt-Svendsen represents yet another path taken by German POWs in America. Not through daring or through writing, but through choosing to stay when he was finally free to go. Vogt-Svendsen had been captured in North Africa, part of the crumbling German campaign in the desert. Like thousands of others, he was transported across the Atlantic and placed in an American camp. His first impressions were the same as Gartner's: surprise at the fair treatment, the food, and the order that ruled life even behind barbed wire. He expected hardship, but what he found was a country that seemed almost untouched by war, where abundance was the norm. Over time, he began to work outside the camp, joining American farmers during harvest season. For many prisoners, this was the first real contact with ordinary civilians, and it often broke down barriers faster than any official re-education program could. Farmers came to trust the men who worked their fields, and in return the prisoners discovered kindness where they had expected hostility. Vogt-Svendsen, like others, was struck by how quickly suspicion gave way to friendship. When the war ended, he was sent back to Germany, but like Gartner, he found a homeland in ruins. Shortages, destruction, uncertainty everywhere. The contrast with what he had seen in America was impossible to ignore. So he did something remarkable. Instead of staying, he applied to return, this time legally. He had seen enough of American life to know that his future belonged there. In the years that followed, Vogt-Svendsen built a new existence in the United States. He found work, married, and integrated into the very society he had once fought against. His story never became famous like Pabel's or widely read like Gartner's, but it carried the same theme. America's treatment of its prisoners left a mark that was impossible to erase. Together, these stories show how one generation of German soldiers was reshaped not by propaganda or ideology. Behind fences, on farms, or in quiet friendships, many discovered that the enemy was not what they had been told, and some, like Vogt-Svendsen, chose to make that enemy's country their home. The Camp Ruston love stories. German prisoners who returned to marry Americans. By now, the stories of Pabel, Gartner, and Vogt-Svendsen show three very different paths. One escaped, one reflected, and one chose to return. But perhaps the most unexpected stories of all came out of Camp Ruston in Louisiana, where war and captivity turned into something even stranger: love. Camp Ruston was one of the largest POW camps in the United States, housing thousands of German soldiers. Like other camps, it provided food, order, and work, but it also brought the prisoners into close contact with local communities. Farmers needed help with harvests, and the army supplied them with POW labor. This meant that for months at a time, German prisoners were not only working alongside Americans, but eating in their kitchens, sharing conversations, and sometimes even joining in small-town social life. For young men far from home, those moments of normalcy felt almost unreal. Inevitably, bonds began to form. Some of the Germans built friendships that lasted long after the war, and in a few cases, those friendships turned into romance. American families who had once seen the men as enemies came to see them as individuals. Daughters of farmers found themselves falling for the very soldiers who, only a year earlier, had been part of Hitler's army. It was a situation no propaganda on either side had ever imagined. When the war ended and the men were sent back to Germany, these romances did not simply vanish. Letters were exchanged across the ocean, promises made, and plans drawn. For several of the Camp Ruston prisoners, the pull of love was stronger than the ruins of their homeland. They applied for visas, crossed the Atlantic once more, and returned not as prisoners but as husbands. These marriages were remarkable symbols of reconciliation. Families who had once feared the German war machine now welcomed former enemy soldiers as sons-in-law. For the men themselves, it was proof that their captivity had reshaped their futures in ways no one could have predicted. If Pabel represented escape and Gartner reflection, the Camp Ruston men embodied something even more powerful, the possibility that in the midst of war's destruction, human connections could defy the lines drawn by uniforms and flags. The Iowa Farmers' Helpers, POWs who came back to work the land. If Camp Ruston showed how captivity could lead to friendship and even love, Iowa revealed another side of the German POW experience. How hard work in the fields created ties so strong that some men returned years later, not as prisoners, but as neighbors. During the war, Iowa faced a serious labor shortage. With so many American men overseas, farmers struggled to harvest corn and soybeans. The solution was to bring in German POWs, guarded but often trusted to work long days in the fields. For the locals, it was strange at first. Men who had once been their enemies now stood beside them in the dust and sun, hoe in hand, picking crops. Yet suspicion quickly gave way to something else. The Germans worked hard, joked in broken English, and in many cases earned the respect of the families they helped. Some were even invited into kitchens for meals, sitting at tables where only months earlier their uniforms would have inspired fear. For the prisoners, the experience was eye-opening. They saw American farming life up close, the rhythm of the seasons, the generosity of families, the abundance of food. Compared to the shortages in Europe, the prosperity was almost unbelievable. For young Germans who had grown up under constant hardship, it left an indelible impression. When the war ended, most were sent home, back to a Germany in ruins. But for a number of the Iowa prisoners, the memory of those farms never left them. In the 1950s, some returned legally, choosing to settle in the very communities where they had once worked under guard. They became farmhands, neighbors, and eventually citizens, welcomed back not as captives but as contributors. Their story highlights a remarkable pattern. Again and again, German POWs discovered that their image of America had been a lie. Instead of cruelty, they found fairness. Instead of hostility, they found opportunity. And in Iowa's fields, they found something even stronger, a sense of belonging that drew them back across the ocean to stay. The Texas murals, prisoners who left their art behind and later returned. If Iowa's story was one of sweat and labor, Texas revealed a different side of the German POWs: creativity. At Camp Hearn, one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in Texas, Germans not only worked but also found ways to express themselves. Some formed orchestras, others staged plays, and a few left behind something far more permanent: art on the very walls of their barracks. The murals they painted were detailed, colorful, and often deeply personal. Some showed landscapes of home, others scenes of German folklore, or even idyllic American countryside. For the men who painted them, it was a way to cope with captivity, a chance to reclaim a sense of humanity in a world defined by fences and orders. For guards and visitors, the murals were striking reminders that these were not faceless enemies, but young men with talent, memory, and imagination. When the war ended, the murals remained, fading with time but never entirely disappearing. And for some of the former prisoners, the images they had left behind became a reason to return. Years later, men who had once been locked behind barbed wire came back to Texas, this time as visitors. They walked freely into the campgrounds, pointed to the walls they had once painted, and shared their stories with Americans who now welcomed them as guests, not captives. These moments carried a strange poetry. The art they had created in confinement had outlived the war itself, becoming a bridge between past and present. For the prisoners who returned, it was a chance to show their children and grandchildren what life had once been like. For Texans, it was a reminder that even in wartime, beauty had managed to survive in the unlikeliest of places. If Iowa revealed belonging through labor, Texas showed connection through creativity. The men who had arrived as soldiers left traces of themselves on American walls, and decades later, those same walls drew them back, no longer as enemies, but as artists revisiting a piece of their own history. The forgotten citizens, POWs who chose the US over a ruined Germany. By now, the stories of Pabel, Gartner, Vogt-Svendsen, the Ruston men, the Iowa farmhands, and the Texas artists show a wide range of paths: escape, reflection, marriage, labor, and art. But behind them lies a quieter story, one that belonged to thousands rather than a handful. The German prisoners who, once released, simply decided they did not want to go back. For many, the return to Germany after 1945 was a shock. Cities were bombed flat, families scattered, food rationed. The contrast with what they had seen in the United States could not have been sharper. In America, even in captivity, there had been meat and bread on the table, order in the streets, and a sense of possibility. Back home, there was only rubble and hunger. It is no wonder that when given the chance, some of these men looked west once more. They were often called the forgotten citizens because their stories never made headlines like Pabel's escape or Gartner's book. Yet quietly in the 1950s and 60s, thousands of former POWs applied to immigrate legally. Some returned to farms where they had once worked under guard, welcomed back by families who remembered them as hard-working boys. Others came back for love, reuniting with women they had met in small towns across the South and Midwest. A few even revisited their old camps, now abandoned, pointing out the barracks where they had once slept. For these men, the decision was not about betraying Germany, but about embracing a life they felt was more hopeful. America had shown them a version of the future they wanted, one built on opportunity rather than ruin. They laid down roots, raised families, and lived out their lives not as prisoners but as citizens. Together, their stories reveal something remarkable. The United States had defeated Germany on the battlefield, but it was in the quiet of the camps, in the fields of Iowa, in the kitchens of Louisiana, and on the painted walls of Texas, that it won something deeper, the respect, even the loyalty, of its former enemies. And in the end, some of those enemies chose never to leave.